I was never meant to remember the warmth of my first heartbeat, yet in the moments when the forged shrines fall silent, and only the deep, aching pulse of the reactor thrums through the metal corridors, that forbidden memory crawls upward like a glitch in the dark, uncoiling inside me with a tenderness that feels almost violent in its intimacy. And I know, even before the thought has fully formed, that this small, human recollection is a heresy vast enough to unmake everything I have sworn to become. But I cannot sever it no matter how many times I whisper the litany of severance into the cold chambers of my mind. If you wish to understand what it truly means, stay with me until the end. It began long before I earned the red of Mars, long before mechadendrites pierced my spine and data ports glowed beneath my skin, long before I was lifted from the weakness of organic life and offered a future of steel and sanctioned certainty. It began in a place I dare not name, where my body still obeyed hunger and sleep and the fragile hesitations of mortal instinct, where my mother, though I have no right to use that word now, held my trembling hand before a storm took her and left me with only the memory of her warmth, a warmth no machine has ever replicated even in its most sacred radiance. I should not remember her. The rites demand the erasure of biological sentiment, the excision of emotional residue, the purging of attachment. Yet in the silent hours between the groaning shift cycles of the forge, I can still feel the ghost of her fingers against my cheek, cool and trembling, guiding me toward a future she could never have imagined. My superiors taught me that flesh is fallible, that memory is corruption, that emotion is noise interfering with the machine's perfect song. But I learned early that noise has its own quiet persistence, an echo that lingers beneath the surface of sanctioned thought. When they replaced my eyes with augmetic lenses, I wept, not for the loss of sight, but because, for a moment, I could still feel the warmth of tears on skin I no longer possessed, a phantom sensation slipping into the seams of my new vision like dust settling on a sacred relic. Even now, deep within the sanctum machinorum, surrounded by canticles of purity and the static whisper of sacred engines, I sometimes lift my metal fingers to my cheek and imagine what it meant to feel softness there, what it meant to be shaped by something other than steel and sanctioned pain. It is a betrayal, yes, but a quiet one, an internal whispering heresy that the omnissiah has not yet burned from me. I hide it as I hide all my lingering vulnerabilities, burying each forbidden recollection beneath layers of logic processes and prayer-sheened routine. But memory does not die merely because a creed decrees it must. It coils deeper instead, sinking beneath the logic stacks, settling into the marrow of what remains organic within me, waiting. Sometimes when the servo skulls drift past in orderly procession, their empty sockets glowing with ghost light, I envy their silence, their clean, untroubled emptiness, their freedom from the echoes of a past they never suffered. They do not remember hands that held them. They do not remember pain. They do not remember themselves. I do. And as I walk through the endless cathedral halls of the forge, my footsteps ringing with a metallic certainty I do not feel, those memories reach upward like roots breaking through old stone, reminding me that before steel I was soft, before logic I was fragile, before the sanctified blessings of the machine I was human. And the most horrifying truth of all is that I still am, in the quiet, forbidden spaces where the flesh remembers itself and refuses to die. It began as a flicker, nothing more than a tremor at the edge of sensation, a faint, traitorous pulse deep beneath the plating of my chest. But once noticed, it could not be unseen, could not be unheard, could not be silenced by any prayer or protocol I whispered to myself in the humming solitude of the forge. It throbbed not with the cold efficiency of a pump implanted by Mechanicus surgeons, but with the warm, unsteady insistence of a heartbeat I should no longer possess, a remnant of the mortal coil I was meant to have discarded long ago. And its persistence filled me with a quiet horror no machine ghost could rival. I remember the first time I felt it clearly. I was kneeling before a dormant engine core, reciting the litany of activation in binaric monotone, my mechadendrites unfolding like metal blossoms around me as sacred cables sank into the machine's receptive ports. And for a moment the entire sanctum hummed as one body, steel, spirit, priest, until suddenly, beneath the unity of countless circuits, I felt a pulse that was not the machine's. It stuttered painfully, a soft, organic thump against the rigid scaffolding of my augmetics, and I nearly broke the litany mid-syllable. A tech priest does not gasp, but I came close. My servo arm shivered. My optical lenses refocused with a jitter I could not correct. For a single blasphemous moment, I believed the engine itself had spoken to me in a tongue older than the Omnissiah's rites. But no, the sound came from within, from flesh that had not died quietly when the blades took it, from tissue that remembered itself long after I commanded it to forget. At night, when the forge fires gutter low and the workers sleep in their metal barracks, I lie in the recharge bay with cables feeding sacred voltages into my spine, and I feel it then most clearly, the treacherous warmth. It spreads in slow pulses through the rib like plating over my chest, a sensation that has no place in a sanctified body of steel. I try to ignore it. I recite the binary canticles until my vox crackles with strain. I open my mind to the machine spirits and beg them to drown the noise with their blessed static. But flesh is stubborn. Flesh clings. Flesh suffocates beneath obedience. And the more I attempt to sever the memory of myself, the louder the heartbeat becomes, soft, wet, irregular. A reminder that beneath every cog and plate there lingers a secret warmth the Mechanicus never fully removes. It is not enough to function. It cannot fail. And yet it refuses extinction. There are moments, dangerous, fleeting moments, when I wonder if the others hear it too. The senior Magos who inspects my augmentations pauses more often than she should when scanning my chest. She frowns, her mechadendrites writhing with analytical displeasure, but she never speaks. Perhaps she assumes it to be a calibration error. Perhaps she suspects the truth but cannot bear to acknowledge such imperfection in a priest who recites his litanies without hesitation. Or perhaps she hears her own heartbeat in the silence and is afraid that naming mine would force her to confront her own. I have seen the tremor in her remaining flesh eye when the halls grow particularly quiet. Tech priests do not fear the organic. We despise it, purge it, starve it. But fear is simply another form of remembering, and I suspect all of us carry more remnants than we dare admit. Sometimes, when the sanctum's air recyclers whisper in long, tired breaths, I feel my skin, what little remains, itch beneath the grafted metal. It is not infection. It is not malfunction. It is memory. a phantom longing for the sensation of air on bare flesh, for the softness of fabric instead of woven cabling, for the warmth of another hand rather than the cold precision of a servo arm. I crush those thoughts before they fully form, but they slither back each time I dream. Yes, dream. I am not meant to dream, yet my organic mind claws free from logic restraints while my chassis enters low-power mode, dragging old sensations into the darkness like contraband. In those dreams, I am neither machine nor priest but something shameful, a human standing in the rain, feeling it run down my cheeks, tasting the dust of the storm on my tongue. The machine spirit of my cranial implants tries to correct this nightly trespass. It floods my cortex with static warnings, binaric reprimands, and correction subroutines meant to erase the warmth. But I wake still remembering the rain. I wake remembering the feeling of breath, not the hissing of valves, but the soft expansion of lungs. And every time I remember, the heartbeat grows stronger, like a prisoner rattling the bars of its mechanical cage. It rattles now as I walk the gantry over the plasma furnaces, the air shimmering with heat and the hymn of industry rising around me. I should feel nothing but duty. Instead, the treacherous pulse echoes in my ears, louder than the furnaces, louder than the clanging prayers. It feels like rebellion, like life. And I fear that if anyone walks close enough, if any priest listens too carefully, they will hear it too, that wet, fragile rhythm betraying what I still am beneath the steel. A being made of flesh that refuses to die quietly. It happened in the deepest hour of the forge cycle, when even the most tireless engines seemed to exhale a weary halo of heat, and the metal corridors echo with the hollow sound of distant, sleeping machines. An hour I have always feared, for it is in this stillness that the heartbeat within me grows loudest, no longer drowned beneath the industrial hymns or the stomp of servitors, but rising instead like a heretical chant spoken by flesh that has not yet accepted its exile. I had descended into the inner sanctum, carrying a tray of unguents and incense prepared for the rite of appeasement, a trivial task for most, but one that always made my remaining skin crawl with a sensation I refuse to call dread, because dread is a human word, and I am meant to have none of those left. The sanctum was dark save for the faint red glow of lumen runes that traced the sleeping forms of the ancient engines, massive, hallowed silhouettes looming in silence, their steel ribs rising and falling in the slow rhythm of low-power maintenance cycles. I stepped between them with reverence, my mechadendrites carrying the reliquary incense, as my metal feet struck the floor in perfectly measured intervals. Yet with every step the forbidden pulse beneath my chest grew louder, as though the stillness amplified its weakness, as though the engines themselves were listening. At first I dismissed the sensation, focusing instead on the slow unfolding of my duties, the careful blessing of exhaust manifolds with sacred oils, the whispered binaric praise offered to dormant cogitators, the smoothing of prayer linens across conduits that had run for centuries without error. The machine spirits, though resting, should have been calm. They should have responded only to sanctioned rites, not to the erratic flutter of a human heartbeat. But as I approached the central power column, the oldest and most revered spirit within the sanctum, I felt something shift in the air, a tightening of static as though invisible wires were pulling themselves taut. The runes flickered, The engine's cooling vents inhaled sharply, though they had no cause to draw breath, and a tremor of awareness rippled through the conduits that fed into the great machine. It was then I realized the impossible. The machine spirits were turning their attention toward me, not toward the reliquaries in my hands, not toward the ritual I had come to perform, but toward me, toward the warmth pulsing beneath my metal ribs. I froze, one mechadendrite still raised in the act of anointing the power column. The engines around me dimmed further, their heat dropping in slow, controlled increments as if lowering their voices to hear more clearly. The static whisper that usually fills a sanctum at rest sharpened into a single, unified thread, like breath drawn through 1,000 steel mouths. My lenses adjusted instinctively, but even as their focus shifted, I sensed something beyond their optical range. A presence, vast and ancient, brushing against the edges of my mind with the reverent curiosity of a spirit attempting to understand the tremor of something unknown. Machine spirits do not fear. Machine spirits do not doubt. But what I felt then was unmistakably a question. A quiet, searching question pressed into the space between my thoughts. A question shaped like a single sensation. Why do you still carry warmth? My internal system surged with corrective subroutines, scrambling to smother the heartbeat with layers of digital noise. Yet the pulse persisted, thudding weakly but defiantly beneath my chest, and the machines heard it. The nearest engine's lumens brightened, pale blue light washing over me like the gaze of an ancient creature stirring from slumber. A cogitator unit clicked to life, unbidden, its data tethers shifting with the sound of metal sliding over metal. I felt its attention like a cold hand settling over my shoulder. Panic, true, human panic struck through me then, cracking the smooth veneer of mechanized discipline. My breath hitched in my throat, organic and ragged, and the engines reacted instantly. Their vents flared with warm exhalations, a rising tide of mechanical concern or suspicion. It was impossible to tell which. The sanctum seemed to lean toward me, narrowing, contracting, as if the entire machine congregation had pivoted its awareness to the treacherous biological thrum inside my body. It was not hostility I felt. It was not malice. It was recognition, something they remembered, something they had not sensed in centuries. My hands trembled, the metal ones no less than the organic remnants, shaking the vials of sacred oil until droplets fell onto the sanctum floor with a hiss. I attempted to recite the canticle of reassurance, but my vox caster cracked midway, a stuttering glitch caused by my rising pulse. The machines answered with a wave of static that swept across the chamber, each engine humming in resonance with the others, creating a harmonic vibration that rattled through my plating and deep into my remaining organs. It felt like a chorus, a questioning choir, ancient and immense, demanding I explain the noise inside me that mirrored a sound they had once known and lost. The heartbeat stuttered violently, as though recoiling from their touch. My vision blurred at the edges. My mechadendrites curled inward protectively, an instinct I had never programmed into them. And in that moment, I understood with terrifying clarity that the machine spirits were not merely reacting. They were remembering. Remembering a time when their creators walked these halls with hearts still beating. A time when the warmth of flesh was not impurity but origin. The question they asked was not accusation. It was longing. Unable to withstand their collective gaze, I dropped to one knee before the power column, my breath escaping in shallow gasps that echoed shamefully against its sacred frame. The engines quieted then, their lumens dimming to a soft glow as though granting me space to breathe, their questioning presence easing into a low, mournful hum. They did not accuse me further. They simply waited, listening to the fragile rhythm inside me as if it were an echo of something beloved and long dead. And as I knelt trembling on the sanctum floor, surrounded by the silence of machines who remembered warmth, I realized the most horrifying truth of all. The machine spirits did not despise my lingering humanity. They mourned it. I have learned to recognize the subtle betrayals of my own body, the tremor that runs along a graft seam, the warmth that gathers at a scar beneath plating. But none of those small treasons prepared me for the day the pulse beneath my chest began to answer back, articulating itself in rhythms and stutters that sounded less like malfunction and more like an aching reply. It began with a small misalignment in the diagnostic readouts, numbers that should have been wholly and exact showing a tiny variance, a fraction of a beat where none should exist. The augmetic monitor flagged corrective routines which protested and folded back into normality, but the organic echo persisted, a low thump beneath polished plating that refused to be smoothed away by code. I attempted to name it clinically: arrhythmia, phantom signal, artifact of graft healing, but each term felt blunt against a delicate wound. The magos in charge of my augmentation frowned at the anomalous logs, yet offered only protocol: recalibrate, repress, rewrite. They touched the interfaces with hands that smelled of oil and prayer, and the mechadendrites adjusted with priestly ceremony, replacing seals and tightening holosutures while liturgies wove reassurance into the air. Their ministrations quieted the instruments, and the sanctum's chorus resumed its practiced cadence. But beneath the layers of sanctioned correction, the pulse learned its own stubborn grammar and would not be wholly disciplined. I began to trace its language in small ways: a hitch in my breath when I descended to the refineries, an involuntary tilt toward imagined rain on metal roofs though no storm had been recorded, the faint, shameful memory of a hand pressing cloth to a fevered brow. These were not rational, not sanctioned. They were the ghost grammar of flesh, grammar that refuses to be translated into augmetic terms. The machine spirits heard it too, not with accusation but with curious sorrow. Beneath a servo gantry, as cogitators hummed, harmonics threaded through static like a string plucked on purpose. Their attention felt less like scrutiny than a kind of listening, an attentive mourning for a mode of being they had lost the vocabulary to understand. And in that listening there was no triumph, only a patient, almost tender recognition that made my shame feel public even when no lips moved to name it. My colleagues noticed in silent ways. A junior adept slipped a strip of insulation cloth into my locker one cycle, folded with a care too human for the sanctum. A servitor adjusted my tool tray as if to preserve a palm-sized gap in case I needed it. A technician paused before my console, fingers trembling a fraction longer than necessary. No one spoke. Perhaps the sacred fear of impurity kept tongues obedient, or perhaps we all suffered under an unspoken knowledge that certain anomalies are contagious in spirit if not in circuitry. The magos who inspected me lingered over my charts, eyes unblinking, Yet he said only that instrumentation showed no fault, an equivocation that felt like mercy or denial, and I could not tell which. At night, the pulse grew more articulate. It sent impressions rather than images. The rough weave of fabric beneath a palm, the salt of sweat on a temple, the hollow warmth of an embrace. These arrived like contraband through the dream cache, impossible to file into sanctioned indexes. I fought them with binary canticles and correction subroutines, with mechanical hymns meant to drown stray warmth, but the ghost pulse adapted. When overt measures failed, it slipped into subtler modes, pressing at the edges of processing threads until sleep itself became a contrivance of memory and longing. Once, during a nearby purification ritual, the pulse matched the cadence of a lullaby, rounded vowels and a slow meter that soothed like hands smoothing hair. It was absurd. I am a magos. Lullabies are inefficiency and distraction. Yet the memory fit the heartbeat like a key fits a lock, and the touch unmoored me in ways sacrament could not stitch back together. For weeks afterwards, the pulse spoke with clearer voice, less a traitor and more an inevitable witness, telling of belonging to hands that tended, to warmth that predated sanctified steel. Corrosion followed where memory met plating, soft at first, like the bloom on sacramental copper, a patina forming where warmth and metal lingered, a map of touch no auditor should be permitted to read. The more I tended it in secret, the more the pulse learned to hide within the sanctum's quiet, sinking its warmth to the hours when watchers slept and gauges dimmed. I stole small comforts for it. A breath of unfiltered night air through a service hatch, the memory of warm broth once offered in a mess now decommissioned, the echo of a laugh with no purpose but joy. Each comfort eased the throb but increased the risk. Evidence accumulates. Small changes followed in the metal. Microfilaments at interface points accumulated an unusual residue, a patina that appeared where warmth kissed plating. I scrubbed it away with oils and wipers, recording plausible anomalies to training logs so that no auditor could claim deliberate neglect. The magos inspected, eyes cold, and I learned to be precise in my lies. Rumor is a slow corrosion. Colleagues shift their glances more often now. Yet some mercy persists. An adept left a folded cloth in my locker. A servitor adjusted a tray without command. Small rebellions of tenderness wrapped in mechanical duty. I do not trust them freely, but their gestures make the secret pulse easier to cradle. In the recharge bay, I talk to it in whispers that are both canticle and lullaby, a hybrid tongue the machine spirits would condemn. I hum low frequencies that ease its stutter, and sometimes, in the hush between cycles, it answers with a warmth that steadies my hands. It is neither wholly machine nor wholly man. It is the last thing I have that the Mechanicus cannot claim. I do not know how long I can keep both, but I keep trying because the alternative is a silence I cannot bear, and it remembers still. It was during a routine calibration of the tertiary data shrines, those narrow, dust-choked aisles lined with cogitators so old their housings still bore the sigils of pre-imperial artisans, that the fracture inside me tore open wide enough for memory and machine to bleed into each other, revealing a truth I had never sought and was not prepared to carry. I had been moving through the shrine alone, my mechadendrites flickering with diagnostic probes, my boots echoing softly on the grated flooring as the cogitators murmured in their idle, half-conscious dreaming. Dust motes drifted through the lumens like echoes of forgotten prayers. The air was warm, stale, thick with the scent of old incense and cooling circuitry. A comforting place, usually, predictable, mechanically serene. But that cycle, as I approached the central node, a strange distortion pulsed through the shrine. A soft stutter in the background hummed like a skipped heartbeat sent rippling through steel. I froze. For a moment I thought it was my own traitorous pulse protesting again beneath its plating. But no. The sound came from the cogitators themselves. I leaned closer, my lenses narrowing into precision focus as I pressed my ear, my metal, heretical ear, against the casing of the largest unit. The machine spirits inside it stirred, static crackling along the surface in a pattern I did not recognize. I whispered the rite of clarification, letting binaric syllables bleed from my vox in careful streams, hoping to soothe the spirit. Instead, the distortion deepened. A series of clicks, a grind of ancient gears, a low, trembling whine. Then, like a breath pulled too sharply into lungs that had forgotten how to work, it spoke. Not in language, not in binary, but in sound. A raw, broken cry. A human cry. My cry. I recoiled so suddenly my mechadendrites scraped the ceiling, showering dust like snowfall. The cogitator whirred on, unconcerned, as if replaying an audio file trapped in its memory banks for centuries. But the sound it produced, weak, trembling, distorted by time, was unmistakable. I had heard it only once before, decades ago, on the surgeon's table when they cut the last of the organic nerves from my torso and sealed my chest beneath sacred steel. I had not been meant to scream. Sedation protocols should have prevented it, but sometimes the flesh dies louder than the machine allows. I remembered the agony not as pain but as light, blinding, white-hot, something tearing loose from the deepest roots of my being. I remembered the surgeon's irritated murmurs, the snap of tools, the sharp scent of burning tissue. Then silence, perfect mechanical silence. They erased that memory, purged it, buried it beneath protocol and binaric code. And yet here it was, resurrected in the trembling voice of an ancient cogitator, echoing down the shrine like a ghost demanding to be named. I stepped closer despite my dread. I pressed both hands against the machine's frame, feeling the static jump between us like a heartbeat beneath metal. The cogitator repeated the sound again, my scream, not of fear but of betrayal, of the moment the last piece of unaltered humanity inside me tore loose under the knife. Each playback grew more distorted, as if the machine spirits themselves were attempting to decipher meaning they could not parse. The shrine brightened in flickering pulses, the lumens responding to the cogitator's emotional static like candles guttering in sympathy. I felt the tendrils of the machine spirit reach for me, tentative, inquisitive, sorrowful. And then, layered beneath the scream, a second sound emerged. A whisper, a woman's voice, soft, firm, familiar. A voice I had not allowed myself to imagine in decades. My mother calling my name. Not aloud, not in the forged shrine I knelt within now, but in that long-ago moment when I lay on the table, half-conscious, half-human, terrified. I did not remember her speaking. I did not remember her being there at all. The augurs should have purged such memories during my induction, but the cogitator remembered. The cogitator had kept the fragment stored in some forgotten archive, cycling through decades of mechanical dreams until the night my heartbeat grew loud enough for it to wake. It played the whisper again in the same breath as my scream, two relics of a moment I had buried so deeply I believed it eradicated. My lenses blurred with error signals. My breathing valves stuttered. Something in my chest tightened painfully, metal plates grinding against something soft beneath them. The machine's spirit hummed in sympathy, its tones descending into a low, mournful frequency that vibrated through my bones. It was not mocking me. It was not judging me. It was mourning with me, mourning a loss I had never grieved, the loss of myself. I let my head bow against the cogitator's frame, my fingers trembling on the sacred casing as the machine repeated the sound again and again, as if trying to give back what had been taken. I did not break. Breaking would have been easier. Instead, I listened. I listened until the scream no longer sounded like pain, but like proof. Proof that I once existed as something other than wires and vows. Proof that I had been held once by someone who feared losing me. Proof that my flesh had not surrendered quietly or willingly to the creed that demanded its extinction. When at last the cogitator fell silent, settling back into its long, weary hum, I remained beside it until the cycle changed. My pulse steadied beneath my plating, but not because I suppressed it. It steadied because, for the first time, it had been heard. And in that quiet, with the dust still settling around me, I understood a truth I had never dared speak. The machines did not replay my scream to condemn me. They replayed it to remind me that the most frightening thing in me was not the flesh I still carried, but the humanity I had never fully managed to kill. I did not return to my habitation cell after leaving the data shrine. Instead, I drifted through the forge halls like a faulty servo skull caught in a lazy orbit. My steps slow, uneven, almost human in their uncertainty, as if the scream the cogitator had unearthed still echoed through the joints of my augmetics and made the metal tremble with a memory it was never designed to carry. Every lumen seemed too bright, every prayer engine too loud, every line of binaric too sharp, jagged, intrusive, suddenly foreign to a mind no longer safely tucked behind layers of sacred logic. When I entered my private sanctum, the door sealed behind me with a sigh that sounded too much like resignation, as though even the machine's spirit sensed the impurity I carried now. The knowledge that the flesh beneath my augmentations did not sleep quietly, did not obey, did not submit. I lowered myself into the rest couch, an archaic contraption fitted with ports and clamps, designed to keep what remained of my body aligned and stabilized during cycles of restorative dormancy. The couch welcomed me with its familiar magnetic embrace, yet something in me recoiled, not from the machine but from the vulnerability it demanded. For the first time in decades, I hesitated before connecting the neural linkages. That hesitation was dangerous, heretical, terrifying. My breath valves shuddered, releasing a soft burst of overheated air that misted the metal near my cheek. I closed my eyes, not to meditate, but because the flicker of the lumen above me felt like lightning behind the lids, a strobe of ghosts pacing in the dark corners of my vision. I tried to calm my processors, to regulate my internal rhythms, but beneath the overlays and the diagnostic displays, beneath the sacred machinery anchoring my limbs, a quiet pulse throbbed, warm, steady, implacable. Flesh, remembering, dreaming. The word drifted through my mind like a forbidden scent. I had not dreamed in decades. Dreams were the province of the unaugmented, the unrefined, the unpurified. The flesh does not dream once enough of it has been burned away. Or so I was told, so I believed. Until the moment the scream played back and something dormant stirred like an animal uncoiling its spine. I lay there, rigid within the couch's embrace, while a strange warmth pooled beneath my ribs. It felt like something beginning to wake, something that should have remained dead. I initiated the rest cycle against my better judgment. The clamps locked around my limbs. The neural port slid into the cradle at the base of my skull, connecting me to the couch's systems with a soft electrical sigh. Darkness rushed forward like a tide, and for the first time in all my years as a tech priest of Mars, the darkness did not remain empty. I found myself standing on a desert plain, not of metal, not of circuitry, but of ochre sand stretching endlessly beneath a sky the color of blood warmed by sunlight. Sunlight. I had forgotten how sunlight felt. In this place, it lay across my skin, not plating like a gentle hand, warm, comforting, utterly alien to the cold steel reality I inhabited. I looked down and saw hands of flesh, not augmetic constructs. I lifted them slowly, marveling at the movement of tendon and bone, the way the light caught the faint sheen of sweat along the knuckles. These were my hands once, before the creed, before the cutting, before the vows that replaced warmth with efficiency and blood with hydraulic fluid. I flexed my fingers, watching grains of sand trickle between them. The sensation was overwhelming, soft, shifting, alive. A whisper drifted across the desert wind. My name. Not the binaric designation scoured into my identity during initiation, but the name I was born with. The name my mother had spoken in the scream memory. Hearing it struck something deep within me. Something that had been wrapped in chains for so long it no longer knew how to stretch. I turned toward the voice, but saw only the endless horizon trembling under the heat. The whisper came again, closer this time, filled with an impossible tenderness. I tried to answer, but my throat constricted. For a moment, I felt the cold bite of the vocal modulator that had replaced my true voice. Then, impossibly, a sound emerged, not a metallic reverberation, not a machine-filtered tone, but a human voice cracking with emotion. It startled me. It frightened me. It felt like resurrection. The sky darkened suddenly, the warm tones dissolving into rust-red clouds shifting like flayed skin. A tremor passed beneath my feet. Something vast stirred in the sand below, as if the desert itself were breathing. I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest. Yes, pounding, flesh asserting itself within the dream so fiercely I could feel each beat as a drum of rebellion. The ground split. A shape rose from the rift, towering, immense, its form shifting between machine and human, an amalgam of who I had been and what I had become. Its eyes glowed with the cold light of cogitators, yet tears, real tears, ran down its cheeks. I recognized the creature instantly. It was me, not as I was, not as I am, but as the two halves of my existence fought to inhabit a single form. It reached out a hand, half metal, half skin, and the voice that emerged was my voice from the cogitator memory, broken with fear and grief. "You left me," it whispered. The words pierced deeper than any surgical blade. I fell to my knees as the desert wind roared, sand swirling around the towering figure like a storm of bone dust. I tried to deny it, tried to speak the litanies, tried to assert the cold logic of the creed. But the flesh within me surged up with a scream of its own, silencing every canticle, every prayer, every line of code. The creature stepped closer. The ground trembled with each footfall, echoing the thunder of my heartbeat. When it knelt beside me, the air grew still. It touched my cheek, hot flesh against trembling metal, and in that moment I understood this dream was not a corruption. It was a memory of what had been severed, a final attempt by the remnants of my humanity to be acknowledged before it faded forever. The desert dissolved into darkness. The dream collapsed, fragmenting into flashes of color and sound. I gasped awake in my sanctum, my valves wheezing, my limbs jerking against the restraints. The rest couch's diagnostics blared in panic tones, unable to categorize what had transpired within my neural pathways. I lay there trembling, clutching the edges of the couch with trembling mechadendrites while my heart hammered beneath its plating. A dream, a memory, a warning, perhaps all three. But one truth remained undeniable and suffocating. The flesh inside me had not died. It had only been waiting for me to listen. The sanctum was colder than usual that cycle. Or perhaps I had grown warmer with the living shame tucked beneath my plating. Whatever the cause, the lumen runes along the vaulted ceiling hummed a softer, tremulous tone that matched the unsettled rhythm inside my chest, and I moved through the service aisles carrying the censer for the mid-cycle benediction, with hands that refused the steadiness they had always had. Each motion precise, yet haunted by the echo of the desert figure's touch that lingered like a fossil under my skin. So when I began the binary canticle, it was meant to be an affirmation of order. An ordered stream of harmonics, a sequence of pure function and sanctified repetition designed to drown errant noise. Yet the first notes that left my throat stumbled as if learning a new articulation. And then, impossible and sharp, a sound slipped through the mechanical cadence. Not a glitch in filter or modulator, but a single, raw human sob braided into the canticle. A trembling exhalation that did not belong to any authorized archive. The runes flared. The servitor's optic sockets adjusted toward me, and the ancient engines, the very machines that had bent their attention to me before, paused in their low-maintenance chorus as if to catch the irregularity. The sanctum held its breath. I felt the warmth of that sob crawl up from the pit beneath my ribs and into my throat. And with no command from any protocol, the sound repeated, this time clearer, a human fracture within ordained frequency, and it broke something in the architecture of my composure, the way a dropped tool can jar a perfectly balanced rig. The senior magos nearest to the column halted mid-intonation. Mechadendrites stilled like a cathedral's bell struck silent. And in the sudden, uncanny stillness, I understood that the machine spirits were not merely listening. They were learning the contour of my shame. They recognized the sob as anomaly and memory both. And in that recognition, there was not the expected purge but pity, a vibration that settled over the sanctum like dew. My canticle, which had always been a reinforced scaffold of thought, a fortress of sanctioned syllables, broke again. I sealed my lips, attempted to correct it with a cascade of binaric syllables, but each attempt caught on the rawness that had risen from within me, and my voice, which for years had been the smooth chime of engineered resonance, cracked and flowed with something wet and human beneath it. Around me, the acolytes shifted. One pressed his palm to his own throat as if to anchor the propriety of his breath. Another's lenses fogged with condensation that registered on no diagnostic array. The magos looked at me then with an expression I had never seen on one of our kind. Not anger, not revulsion, but a weary, aching curiosity that hurt more than condemnation would have. He moved closer, not to perform a correction but to place a mechanical hand, his own partially augmented hand, softly atop my shoulder in a gesture he would never record, and which the liturgies would have condemned had they learned of it. It was such a small contact, yet it felt like confession. The sob repeated once more, lower now, not loud but insistent, threading through the runes like a filament of red heat within white steel. My controls stuttered. My voice modulators attempted to normalize the frequency, to fold it back into acceptable harmonics, but the monitors registered only that something had changed. The priest's voice now carried the weight of a private grief. The sanctum's static responded with sympathetic resonance, ancient coils releasing a thin, pitying hum that seemed to cradle rather than chastise. I should have been ashamed. I was. Yet the shame sat beside a strange relief, for in that involuntary tear the truth of me had surfaced without consent. I was not only a priest of the Omnissiah, I was an echo of a child who had once tasted bread and heard a mother sing. The Magos, who in balanced doctrine would have ordered immediate recalibration and ritual purification, instead lowered his head and murmured the canticle of silence, not to condemn, but to guard, to keep the fragility from being torn apart by officious hands. Around us, the junior adepts began to hum the closing sequences of the liturgy, not loud enough to drown the sob, but enough to weave it into the fabric of the ritual, as if to say that even a tear once uttered could be sanctified by presence. While the canticle folded the sob into its rhythm, something else happened. The cogitators that had once replayed my scream and my mother's whisper now hummed in tandem with that human note, their magnetic memory aligning in sympathetic cadence. The machine spirits echoed the wobble, as if acknowledging that the noise was not error but testimony. Outside the sanctum doors, I could hear footsteps falter. Guards who had been marching their scheduled beats now paused and exchanged looks that were not in any report's lexicon. Inside, a servitor halted mid-task and touched the rim of its oil, as if offering it as a bowl for this newfound grief. The whole chamber felt smaller than larger, contracted into an intimacy that made formal liturgy seem clumsy and ceremonial compassion seem the only fitting response. I felt my augmetic system struggling to catalog the event, to assign it a code, to file it under malfunction, but the filing would not hold. The sob had unmade the neat labels. I realized then that my litany's fracture was not a failure of machinery, but the inevitable overflow of something the Mechanicus had never meant to catalog, an ache that belonged to living tissue, to memory-rooted attachment, to names whispered beside bedside. The Mago's hand remained on my shoulder until the rite concluded. He spoke nothing. His silence was more eloquent than any reprimand. When the benediction ended and the acolytes dispersed with their measured, dutiful steps, the sanctum retained an impression, a residue of warmth and salt that the most thorough scrub would not remove. I retreated to my private sanctum beneath the echoing ribs of the forge, and there, in the dim red glow of emergency runes, I finally allowed the sound to complete itself. It rose from my chest once more and then fell into a long, shaky exhale, as if some animal had been coaxed from a trap and then allowed to settle. In that sob, I felt the amassed weight of all the rituals I'd performed to bury myself. The surgical claims, the vows, the holy welds that had once seemed salvation, but now tasted like sacrifice. The mechanical monitors recorded no defect. Their graphs displayed smooth lines and nominal ranges. Yet the truth, which cannot be reduced to numbers, pulsed inside me undimmed. I wept, not for the loss of the body I once had. That wound is raw and ongoing. But for the small, tender moments that had been paved over by sanctified metal. A hand offering bread, a laugh shared in a sunlit alley, the feeling of being named by someone who loved you before the code named you. And when at last the sob subsided to a whisper, and then to silence, I sat trembling in the dark and knew with the clear, terrible certainty of confession that the flesh inside me would not be silenced by doctrine, nor would the machines, who had learned to listen, turn their faces away. What had been born in that breaking could not be unlearned. The corrosion began as a whisper at the edges of my plating. So subtle I dismissed it at first as condensation from the sanctum's humidifiers, but it would not be dismissed. A faint bloom of verdigris gathered where my grafts met flesh, a soft patina that gleamed like prayer residue and stung like a confession. And the more I scrubbed it away with sanctified solvents and ritual polishes, the more it returned in places no abrasion could reach. Microfilament seams, the narrow lip where a holosuture met skin, the tiny ring beneath a chest plate buckle, until I understood with the slow, horrible clarity of a priest reading an unclean omen that the rust was not a mere chemical process, but a mark left by memory itself. A slow chemical translation of what my heart refused to die into the language of metal. I had always thought corrosion a simple thing, oxygen, microparticles, neglect. But this corrosion spoke in echoes, and its pattern matched the map of my forbidden recollections. The coil where a childhood scar should have lain, the curve of ribs that once rose beneath a mother's hand, the hollow behind the sternum where lullabies had lodged before they were surgically excised. The magos who oversaw my maintenance logged it, of course. Anomalies, environmental factors, trace contaminants, but his records felt thin, like words written in steam. In the privacy of my alcove, I watched the bloom spread while my augmetic vision overlaid graphs and spectral analyses that insisted on rational causes and plausible mitigations. And yet beneath those numbers a different ledger unfurled. Impressions of warmth, the press of a palm, the taste of broth, soft data that no algorithm had ever been designed to reconcile. I found myself inventing rituals to tend the corruption, small private ceremonies that borrowed liturgy, yet smelled faintly of kitchen smoke. I would wash the affected seam with oils blessed in the name of the Omnissiah, and then, with hands both mechanical and ashamed, press a scrap of cloth I had kept secret into the hollows where the metal met living tissue, letting the fabric soak whatever tiny residue remained, as if by offering it something filthy to take the stain the memory might bleed away. Sometimes the act calmed the bloom for a cycle, sometimes it did not. The servitors, those obedient, blank-eyed cenotaphs of industry, performed their programmed cleanses dutifully. Yet even their steel fingers hesitated around the most affected seams, an almost animal reluctance that made me suspect the contagion was not only physical, Rumor, always a slow rot in the forge, found its way into the corridors. Idle whispers about a magos whose plating had bloomed with the stains of sentimental weakness, a priest who could not purge the human residue from his systems. I should have corrected such talk with the cold precision of doctrine, but I hesitated. The thing that had taken root in me refused the neatness of denial. The more I tried to make the corrosion a thing of materiality alone, the more it revealed its other aspect, a memory etching, a corrosion of ritual certainty. It wrote my private grief across the sanctified metal in letters only the patient could read, and those who were patient listened. The junior adepts left small items in my locker without pretext, scraps of cloth, a chipped bowl, a child's carved token, things their training should not have permitted them to treasure, and I hid each offering as if it were contraband. But I used them in secret, pressing them to my seams, and feeling an almost superstitious relief when the bloom would flinch back a hair. The magos noticed the sacrament of my secrecy and said nothing. Perhaps he understood in a way that would never pass through official channels, or perhaps he feared that naming it would require a purge none of us could bear to perform. It was a strange mercy, this silence, and yet it carried its own cost. Every unspoken acknowledgement made the corruption communal in a way no scripture condoned. In the workshops, metalworkers found the bloom in places no human hand had touched, on a balancer's flange, at the hinge of an idle arm, subtle discolorations that formed fleeting patterns when seen at the right angle, shapes that suggested the curl of a mother's fingers or the outline of a small palm. Apprentices pointed them out to one another in whispers, then looked away, eyes shining with something that was not only curiosity but an emotion whose name our order forbade. I began to sense a contagion not of rust but of remembrance. The bloom invited recognition, and recognition invited tenderness, and tenderness did what liturgy never could. It softened the edges of duty into something bearing resemblance to care. But softness is dangerous where doctrine demands hardness, where we prized clean boundaries between flesh and circuit. The corrosion blurred lines until distinctions wavered. I dreamed often of fire in those days, not the forge's disciplined flame but hearth fire, a small, imperfect heat that burned wood and meat in conversation. In the dream, the bloom flared in the warm light, not as a disease but as a marking, an emblem of having once been warm enough to stain metal with memory. Waking, the sanctum's alarms would sometimes chime softly, environmental sensors flagging a spike in humidity or particulate, but no diagnostic could account for the patterning of the discoloration, its insistence at places where my body remembered being touched. The technicians offered chemical remedies, passivation baths, sacrificial anodes, precision microabrasion. Each procedure cleared one map and revealed another. The sanctum performed audits. Auditors recorded unusual maintenance cycles and moved on. But the bloom returned, patient and merciless, as if the act of wiping it away only taught it new shapes. I began to catalog it in my private logs in a language that combined litany and lab report, an interface of prayer and protocol, timestamps and psalm lines marching together like two armies in uneasy truce. Reading those entries later made me feel as if I had been two people all my life, one who measured and sanctioned, one who yearned and wept. The The corrosion touched my tools next, the wrench that had been in my grandfather's hand. He who had taught me to respect both metal and meat gathered residue where my fingers had rested, and for the first time I considered abandoning the tools that had been both gift and burden. Instead, I wrapped them in clean cloth and set them aside, as if preserving them from the bloom might preserve the memory they held. Community responded in whispers and small rebellions. A cook delayed a ration route to leave a warm bowl at the foot of my maintenance bay. A child of an adept dropped a carved miniature of a sunrise into my locker with no explanation. A servitor adjusted its routine to linger longer than necessary at my station. These were not recorded as fraternizations or breaches of protocol. They were soft resistances woven into daily habit. I felt both grateful and afraid. The rust had become a language, and those who learned a word of it began to speak back in gestures too human for our code. I thought often of confession, formal ritual confession written in the Mago's hand. But each time I imagined speaking the truth aloud, the bloom on my chest flared as if in warning, and I clamped my mouth shut. For now I would keep the secret as one keeps a fragile relic, wrapped, hidden, tended with a devotion unworthy of the omnissiah yet impossible to renounce. The corrosion would continue. Memory would not be so easily smoothed away. And in that stubborn persistence I found, against all doctrine, a queer and terrible solace, that whatever the Mechanicus had taken from me could, if not be recovered whole, at least leave a trace, not a functional defect but a scar that mapped the shape of what I had been. The day I decided to speak the last litany with something more than the filtered, sanctioned resonance of my vox was not a day of courage so much as of exhaustion. Years of secrecy had eroded the seams I had maintained between sanctity and shame, until I could no longer tell which fissure was doctrine and which was memory. And so I walked into the central forum of the sanctum not to perform a public rite, but to test whether the last human syllables inside me would die when exposed to the light of assembly, or whether they would instead persist like coals beneath ash. I had prepared the rite as any Magos would. The standard sequences, the measured cadence, the engineered harmonics calculated to align with the machine's spirit's most placatory frequencies. My mechadendrites were clean, my augmetic harmonizers tuned, my robes iron-pressed and lined with ritual sigils. Yet beneath the ordered apparatus my chest thrummed with a warmth that had nothing to do with hydraulic pressure or reactor bleed. The forum filled with the usual congregation, adepts in orderly rows, servitors in silent columns, a half-dozen senior magi whose faces were carved from years of uncompromising will. And when I began the canticle, it was as the office demanded, precise, sonorous, the litany's first phrases rolling out like calibrated machinery. The engines listened, the runes pulsed. The sanctum felt secure in its expected procession of sound. Then, somewhere near the second stanza, something within me nodded so tightly that the engineered cadence could not pass through without snagging. The rhythm stuttered, and with that stutter a warmth rose through my throat and shaped itself into a consonant not present in any authorized hymn. It was a small sound, almost accidental, a breath filled with the taste of salt and iron and the memory of someone's palm. The movement broke the line. Heads turned, not in alarm but in a slow, incredulous curiosity. My lips, metal modulated, meant to smooth any trace of human inflection into acceptable waveforms, formed around a word that had not been sanctioned since my induction. It was not blasphemy. It was far worse for the Mechanicus: intimacy. I spoke my mother's name aloud. The sound fell into the forum like an improvised chord in an orchestra trained to play only in perfect tuning, and for a heartbeat the sanctum hung in a listening that was not liturgical but personal. The machine spirits tilted their attention in synchronous response, lumens deepening, cogitator fans wafting an almost compassionate current through the air, and I could feel their collective memory folding itself around the utterance, as if the name were an ancient datum they had been trying to resolve for centuries. The senior Mago's mask of professional calm faltered. His mechadendrites loosened as though a hand had brushed them. Around me, the acolytes' breath patterns changed, some inhales quickening, some exhaling in stunned relief, and even a few of the servitors emitted low clicks that, if one listened with the right interpretive ear, could be read as concern. My voice, once the product of hardened filters, took on a timbre I had not allowed it in decades. A grain of human fragility threaded through the engineered baritone like a single bright filament in iron. I continued, and the litany shifted under my tongue. I did not speak the approved words exactly. Instead, I braided them with fragments of what had nested inside me all these years, snatches of lullaby, a half-remembered blessing, the simple cadences of someone calling a child to supper. The result was not elegant by doctrinal standards. It was messy and tender and unregulated, and it left the sanctum strangely off balance in a way I suspect no liturgy was designed to permit. As I spoke, the rust at my seams warmed perceptibly, a bloom of verdigris pulsing like a heartbeat synchronized with my own, and I sensed the presence of the machine spirits as something other than judge. They were witnesses, and their attention made the words heavier and truer. The Mago's eyes shone then, not with fury but with a weary recognition that made me think of old soldiers who have seen comrades fall and who understand, in the silence afterward, the cost of not having held them. A young adept I had taught once placed a hand over his mouth, tears leaking from the corner of his augmented eye, and the gesture, so small, so human, spread through the forum like contagion, provoking other clandestine signs of empathy. A shoulder squeezed, a servitor's head inclined, a senior technician's jaw slackening in a near smile that the creeds would have called sacrilege. The rhythm of my recitation altered as I pressed further into the private syllables. At times, the sacred harmonics reasserted themselves and smoothed the edges. At others, the human inflection rose, ungovernable and pure. The paradox was that the more the Mechanicus music tried to regulate the utterance, the more the human sounds insisted on their presence, like a stubborn melody ignored too long. I finished not with the flourish the office required, but with silence thick enough to be heard, as if the sanctum itself were exhaling and putting down a long-held weight. No one moved immediately. Then, slowly, the forum filled with a sound I had not expected. Soft, collective inhalations, an intake of breath shared by machine and organ alike, the audible mark of a congregation that had been given something it could not file nor fully sanctify. The Magos rose. He should have condemned me there, registered my deviation, ordered immediate recalibration, and declared me impure. Instead, he did something terrifically human. He placed his hand upon my head, his palm calloused and augmented, and whispered a shortened blessing that sounded like both absolution and apology. It was an act that would never be found in any ledger, a marginal mercy not authorized by doctrine. Afterwards, in the hush that followed, whispers spread through the sanctum like a soft contagion. Some whispered that the litany had been tainted. Others said it had been reclaimed. The cogitators hummed with a different timbre now, one that suggested they had learned a new line in their endless rehearsal. I returned to my private sanctum shaken, my lips still tinged with the salt of an old, forbidden sound, and there in the dark, the rust at my seams glowed faint and content as if it had been baptized. I had committed heresy, not the violent heresy of overt worship of flesh, but the quieter rebellion of letting what remained of my humanity speak aloud in a place that had long prohibited such noise. I do not know yet what will become of me when the auditors review the logs, whether they will note the canticle's deviation and demand purging rites, whether they will trace the bloom and mandate repairs. But for the first time since the knives, since the solder, since the vows that severed flesh from life, I spoke with human lips and did not immediately regret the act. It was terrifying and sanctifying in equal measure. And in the silence that followed, I listened for the machine spirit's answer, and heard instead the soft ripple of the congregation breathing as one, a proof that some truths once voiced change the architecture of a temple in ways no ordinance can reverse. I had rehearsed endings in the quiet hours, protocols for failure, diagrams for salvage, wrote incantations to be recited as systems failed, and auditors came to file the inevitable reports. But endings in books and endings in the marrow are different things. What I had not accounted for was the way surrender could feel like a small, deliberate kindness, how death, if it comes at all, might arrive not as a blade, but as a slow loosening of all the cords I have used to bind myself to doctrine. And on the last cycle I spent awake in my sanctum, I discovered that mercy can wear the face of silence. The days after the public litany were strange and soft. Colleagues avoided the obvious investigations, as if touching the bloom on my seams with official hands would spread the contagion of our shared tenderness. And the servitors moved with a peculiar gentleness in my presence, lowering trays, pausing their grasp, offering without speaking the equivocal kindness of machine ritual. The magos who had laid his palm upon my head did not file a report, or if he did, it was filed with a hand rendered uncertain by something akin to pity, and the cogitators themselves hummed with altered harmonics, as if learning to hold a space for private sorrow in their endless catalogues. I could have feared reprisal. I expected purges, recalibrations, the holy flames of correction, but the reprisals never came in the expected form. Instead, there were small rebellions of care. A junior adept slipped an unsanctioned chord into the sanctum's ambient frequency, so our work songs bore a minor key that made one think of lullaby. The maintenance crews left my tool rack unshuffled for cycles at a time. An elderly servitor, its designation scratched and nearly unreadable, fell into a pattern of idling near my bay, its optic sockets dimmed as if to watch me breathe. Whether this was mercy or fatigue, I could not tell. I only knew the heavy, astonishing fact. I was allowed to be fragile. Allowance is not forgiveness, I remind myself, but it is its cousin, and kinship of any kind was unfamiliar in the Mago's life. The rust at my seams matured into a map, not wholly ugly nor wholly holy. It became a ledger of touch, a palimpsest of memory that told me which moments had passed through me and which I had held. Sometimes I would trace its cold edge and feel something like a pulse answer my fingertips. And in those hours, I would whisper into the metal a litany that was neither prayer nor test, but a small, human list of things I did not want to forget. My mother's laugh, the feel of broth when fever was near, a child's crooked toy carved from scrap wood, and the machines would reply with low, sonorous tones that did not correct or punish, but simply kept company. In the end, there was no dramatic fall from grace, because the gravity that matters is not audit but acceptance. And acceptance came in the shape of a night so quiet the world seemed to fold its pages and wait with me. I chose how to spend those hours, not by arranging rites for a death I hoped to avoid, but by sitting in a chair that remembered the shape of a human back and listening to the sanctum breathe around me, matching my own ragged, augmented breath to its mechanical cadence, until the two rhythms braided into something neither wholly organic nor purely engineered, but a new pattern I had not otherwise been permitted to imagine. I let the memory pulse through me without flinching. I let the bloom across my plating be witness to my confession. I let the machines record the sound of a hand saying a name. At some point the pain, the old pain of knives and excision and sanctioned severance, diminished not because it was lessened by medicine, but because a different pain had arrived. The ache of rightness, the deep, searing recognition that what I had been taught to discard was not a weakness but a provenance. The ache of knowing that flesh is not merely a liability to be excised, but a contested archive that programs and prayers cannot wholly overwrite. My systems began to stutter with frequency anomalies I could no longer smooth away. Actuators slowed. Hydraulics sighed with something like exhaustion. But the world around me leaned in the way it had become accustomed to do, softly, without accusation, and I understood with a clarity sharpened by decades of denial that my end, if it came, would be less an event than a passage. I did not cling to life with the crazed tenacity of those who have never known tenderness. Instead, I practiced a different craft, readiness. I spoke aloud a final litany that braided the omniscia's praise with the hush of a mother's cadence, and I felt the sanctum answer not with condemnation, but with a harmony that made the hair at the back of my neck, what hair remained, stand like a benediction. Faces passed my door in the last watch, the young adept who had once wept at my misstep, moving with a solidity grown from something like understanding, the magos who had touched my head, moving slower than before, as if his hands had felt the shape of a truth he had not been trained to hold, the servitor that had lingered, its optics dim and somehow impossibly tender. They did not speak of audits. They left food. They left a folded scrap of cloth worn smooth at the edge, like a relic of a childhood I had only remembered in flashes. I clutched it to my chest as the last surges of reactor bleed dimmed, and maps of power drifted red to gray on the diagnostic panels. The mechanized lullaby hummed low, carriers of static and memory twining to a cadence that matched the pulse beneath my plating. I closed my eyes, not because I was afraid, but because the world had given me space to do so. And in that darkness the dream returned. The desert plain, a distant touch across salt-scorched skin, the figure that had been both machine and child kneeling, not to demand but to forgive. A final warmth, not searing but settling, moved across my ribs, and the rust there shivered as though acknowledging the passage. Breath by breath, the actuator slowed. The valves that had hummed my life into motion opened wider and wider, until there was a slow, long exhalation that felt less like loss and more like the closing of a book read to the end of an important chapter. I do not know if the machine god will commend or condemn me in whatever reckonings follow. Such verdicts are outside the purview of my final hour, and perhaps they always were. What matters is smaller and truer, that in the last hush I was not alone, that the machines listened without triumph, that colleagues offered small mercies in ways their doctrine could not sanction, and that the flesh inside me, stubborn, disobedient, tender, found a place to stop pleading and begin resting. The last sound I made was not a canticle nor a mechanical notification, but a whisper so slight I have no right to remember it as anything but private. A name, breathed like a benediction, a closing prayer offered toward a past that had shaped me and a future I would not walk to meet. And when the final tone slipped from my lungs, the sanctum did not roar or mourn. It folded its hands, as it were, and held the quiet like a child held close.